I want to welcome you tonight to The Meaning of Being Human, a conversation on religion and medicine, which is part of the Religion and Public Life program lecture series, and I'll tell you more about our other co-sponsors in a little bit. Religion in American society and globally has incredible potential to spark conflict, and it has incredible potential to generate cohesion. Whether there are debates about evolution, embryonic stem cell research, immigrant rights, international conflict, or religious expression in the political and business world, issues involving religion often become incredibly divisive and incredibly personal. Yet religious institutions and individuals have also motivated civil rights, peace in international contexts, gender equality, and compassionate medical care. The hope of the Religion and Public Life program is to facilitate scholars and scholarship speaking into these issues. The vision in the program is to bring the academy out of the ivory tower and into the most pressing religious issues of our time, to build bridges with those who might benefit from the very best scholarship on these contentious issues. The Religion and Public Life program has several strategic initiatives, which I'd like to tell you a little bit about, namely the Undergraduate Student Fellows Initiative, a Books and Public Scholarship Initiative, which is a forum for scholars to review and discuss forthcoming books on religion that are poised to make a big public impact, a Reading Religion at Rice Initiative, which gathers scholars and community members to review scholarly manuscripts on issues related to religion and public life that are highly relevant to particular constituencies, and, as you're joining us here tonight, a semi-annual lectureship bringing scholars to the Rice University and Houston area to teach us around distinct themes related to religion and public life. The major substantive theme for this year's programming is religion and medicine. Rice University is strategically located to host initiatives on religion and medicine. The university sits at the heart of the Texas Medical Center, and we're privileged tonight to have quite a few members from the medical center community joining us. I'm very, very thankful for that. A community that attracts professionals and patients from all over the world and is a global leader in innovative medical research and care. We're joined in sponsorship of tonight's event by the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine, directed by Baruch Brody, who unfortunately couldn't join us tonight because of illness. And Professor Brody is also a philosopher at Rice University, so holds this wonderful joint appointment, which sort of embodies the spirit of the kind of strategic interplay that we have between the medical center community and Rice University. As well as co-sponsorship tonight by the Cultural Studies of Science and Technology Workshop, which is organized by Assistant Professor of Philosophy Melinda Fagan. And we're very thankful for that sponsorship and initiative by the humanities as well, so thank you for that. My special thanks to Catherine Sorrell, as well, a post-baccalaureate fellow in the sociology department, has worked hard for the past couple of months, putting together these 2 days of events, and to the Baker Institute for kindly hosting this event in this beautiful space. It's a wonderful place to have these kind of events, and to the Kinder Institute for Urban Research, which houses the Religion and Public Life program. Researchers are increasingly interested in the role of religion and spirituality in healthcare. Researchers and healthcare providers are aware that a patient's religious beliefs and practices and sentiments may play a role in coping with disease as well as medical decision-making. The topic of religion and medicine provides immediate fodder for controversy and for conversation, relevant to practitioners, scholars, and lay people, all of whom have an interest and a stake in what takes place within the corridors of medicine. Professor John Evans, who is our invited scholar tonight, has done what I think is the most broad-ranging and innovative work on the sociology of bioethics, and in particular, religious approaches to bioethics, really of any scholar in the country. Evans is a professor in the sociology department at the University of California, San Diego, who will next year be a chair of that department. His research focuses on religion, culture, politics, and science, and Evans braved the beautiful, coming from beautiful San Diego weather to come into, we didn't have such nice weather today in Houston, unfortunately. Usually we can really draw people this time of year, right, to come out of the cold San Diego weather. Evans's first book, Playing God, Human Genetic Engineering and the Rationalization of Public Bioethical Debate, which was published by the University of Chicago in 2002, won the Distinguished Book Award in Religion from the American Sociological Association. Evans holds a PhD in sociology from Princeton University. He's been a visiting fellow of the prestigious Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, think Einstein, as well as held fellowships at the University of Edinburgh, the University of Munster. His latest book, which we are here to discuss tonight, is Contested Reproduction, Genetic Technologies, Religion, and Public Debate, which is also published by University of Chicago this last year. Contested Reproduction examines how ordinary religious people in the US talk about reproductive genetic technologies. Perhaps I can be a little bit more specific about what we mean by the 50-cent phrase reproductive genetic technologies by giving you an example, one of Evans's own examples from the book. Imagine a couple who are both carriers of the Tay-Sachs gene, and they want to ensure that their offspring do not have this gene. Tay-Sachs being a genetic disorder that causes the destruction of a child's nervous system by the time the child is 5 years old. Choosing a simple genetic technology, they could find out whether they're carriers for the Tay-Sachs gene before deciding to have children. Alternatively, the woman could become pregnant, then have fetal testing through amniocentesis to determine whether the fetus has the trait, and then have an abortion if the fetus is afflicted with a disease. This couple could also use pre-implantation genetic diagnosis by creating multiple embryos through in vitro fertilization, and then have the embryos tested for the Tay-Sachs gene, implanting the ones who express the Tay-Sachs trait and discarding the rest. This example that Evans cites is incredibly controversial, not so much in the first case that I gave, but certainly in the second and third. And yet it is among the least controversial of applications of reproductive genetic technologies. Consider other applications, such as ensuring that children do not have a gene that would make them susceptible to Alzheimer's disease when they're 50 years old. Or to ensure enhancements, such as that a child has blue eyes or blonde hair. And probably all of us are starting to become a bit more uncomfortable. These are all scenarios that are either happening or will happen in the not too distant future. We need to be having more and better honest public discussion about such issues, issues that may fundamentally change the meaning of being human. John Evans is one of the few scholars who's entering into such fundamental debates. In Contested Reproduction, he draws on nearly 200 interviews with religious and secular individuals and the responses to a public opinion poll. I should mention that Brazos Books will be selling and Evans will be signing copies of Contested Reproduction after our discussion tonight. It's a highly readable volume, which I've enjoyed and learned from personally, so I recommend it and commend it to you. Evan argues in Contested Reproduction that it's both possible and even necessary to have a civil public discourse on reproductive genetic technologies. And as we have done in the past, we intend to model such a civil public discourse here tonight. If you could join me in welcoming John Evans to Houston and to Rice. Now he's on the hot seat. So here's how it's going to proceed. I'm going to start off by interviewing Professor Evans for about the next 25 minutes. And your assignment, my students will know that I always give assignment while I'm talking. I don't want any passive listeners. So your assignment while we are talking is for you to be listening in on this conversation and for you to be formulating your own questions. And so when I give you the cue, I'll set a few ground rules for how our question and answer will proceed. But when I give you the cue, then you're to line up at these two microphones. But first, if you could listen in for a few minutes while we just talk amongst ourselves. So Professor Evans, you've written this book called Contested Reproduction. What does this even mean? What does the title of the book mean, Contested Reproduction?
Well, First, I just want to say thank you very much for having me. I'm actually pretty certain I've never been on a stage with plants in front of it before. And I also say thanks for plugging my book, and as I like to tell people, for every book that's sold, that's $3.50 towards my daughter's Rice University Education Fund.
That's right, so we're already recruiting. He has a 7-year-old.
I'll be rich. So what does it mean? Let me start with a very quick anecdote, which is we interviewed ordinary religious citizens about this. And my research assistants were graduate students in sociology, probably average age 30 years old. And we interviewed a woman who was approximately my mother's age, who said to us at the beginning of this interview, she said, "Life is so tough for people your age. What we used to do was we would get pregnant, wait to see what happened, wait to see what came out, and loved whatever appeared. However, you have these more difficult issues before you." Now, she wasn't one who then said, "Therefore, I oppose everything." She simply said, it's so much more difficult, it's more contested, and there's more to think through. And whereas people who were younger than that had always lived in the era where these were choices they had to be made, she had finished her reproduction, shall we say, probably by the early 1960s, before any of these sorts of things were even possible. So things have dramatically changed. And what I thought when I started doing this book was, there are many ethical issues as to what to do about this, and Baruch could have enlightened us about what various philosophical traditions have to say. But one of my approaches is to say that religion, in general, has been discussing issues like this for hundreds or thousands of years. And the people who are in these religious traditions have a collective wisdom that has been developing over the years. So let's ask them about what they think. And therefore, you reveal their thought processes.
And what do you think? You mentioned Baruch Brody, of course, who's a philosopher, and when I've heard these issues discussed before, I've usually heard them discussed by ethicists, philosophers, other humanists, occasionally by natural scientists. You are the rare breed called a social scientist, like myself, and I'm a fan of our work, but why should others be? So what does social science in particular have to bring to these kind of issues, which might be best left to philosophers and maybe physicians?
Well, there's two perspectives on that. One would be, in a democratic society, we generally don't want to rely upon ethicists and other experts to tell us what to do. We all have to go vote. And so knowing what other people think helps us to inform our own decisions. That said, we do rely justifiably on experts to help us frame and understand debates. Do you want to know where to build a nuclear energy plant, which strikes me as a pretty relevant issue? You don't ask me, you ask an engineer of some sort. And therefore, philosophers and the like have an appropriate role in the public sphere. Empirical research like ours, where we go ask people, can actually really inform philosophical analysis, because it might find that certain assumptions are just wrong. They could say, well, what if people would do X? When if you study it, you find that no one would do X. And so it's a totally moot issue. So through investigating what people actually think and what people actually do, we can put a more fine point on much philosophical ethical analysis.
I'm going to read a quote from your book, which made me really think, and hopefully the crowd will think it's interesting as well. So at the beginning of your book, you quote a political strategist who, writing about fears of social inequality as a result of reproductive genetic technologies, writes that, quote, "The trend to inequality will grow even stronger in the years ahead if new genetic technologies offer those with sufficient resources the possibility of enhancing the intelligence, health, beauty, and strength of children in the womb." You go on to say that some make stronger claims about this revolution, such as that it will change our ideas about what it means to be human, which is where we got the title of tonight's program, from that piece of your book. Say more for us, for those who have not yet read the book, about your opinion on this. Will the new genetic technologies change what it means to be human? And so what? So what if they do? Is this a good thing or a bad thing in your estimation?
Well, there's two different senses that people say technologies like this could change what it means to be human. The first is most articulated by people who are called transhumanists. And their general perspective is that the people in this room, who we'll call human species 1.0, are flawed. We lose our hair. Yeah. We are not so healthy. We're not as intelligent as we could be. We have various limitations. So why not create human species 2.0? 2.0 wouldn't be susceptible to these diseases. We wouldn't lose our hair. We would be more intelligent, and so on and so forth. Why not, through human artifice, create essentially a new human species? Now, we laugh, but that was a goal of many people, certainly into the 1950s, and many people articulate this position today. This is often articulated in movies such as the classic Gattaca, where there's essentially there's a society where the genetic haves and the genetic have-nots. I've actually not been so concerned about that in my career for a couple of reasons. One, increasing someone's strength in this society is irrelevant due to mechanization and the like. Moreover, if you create Michael Jordan clones, well, it's the star-bellied sneeze-it principle. So if any of you have had children, there's a Dr. Seuss book where this guy comes to town and convinces all the people that they should have stars on their bellies. They're called sneeze-its. And he charges everyone to put a star on their stomach. And then they all think, wow, we all have one of these, but this doesn't make us different. We need something else. And so he turns the machine and says, I'll, for a price, take them off. And so people take them off, and oh, this makes us distinct. Well, if everyone looks like Britney Spears and everyone is tall as Michael Jordan, it doesn't give you any advantage. The one advantage would be is if you made people super intelligent, and people can't even describe what his intelligence is, let alone finding the genes for it. So at present, I haven't been so concerned about that. The second form I've been much more concerned about, which is the second way that it could change what it means to be human, that many philosophers have been concerned about, which is it would change our ability to do these sorts of things, will change what we think humans are. So I would ask everyone in this room, what makes you different from a dog? So many of you would have theories like what's called a philosophical vision, which is you have certain capacities that your dog lacks. Forward vision, speech, things like this. A classic, what's called Christian anthropology, is that you are human because you are made in the image of God. This is another dominant one. Well, there are many of these things out there that people are concerned that if we engage in these technologies, it'll teach everyone that you are your genes, or you are your DNA, and you can be manipulated. You can be essentially a product of our own will. Your children can become like an object. In the same way we would design a car, we would design a table, we can design a child. So the concern with humanity, articulated by many people, is that if we can design a child in the way we can design a radio or a car, we will think of that child like an object. We will think of all humans like objects. And so it'll change our idea of what humanity itself is. This concern, when we talk about our humanness, strikes me as more plausible than the idea that we will create a superhuman species that will become the overlords of everybody else.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. You spend a lot of time in the book, and really the fundamental population in the book is looking at religious people's views, in particular different Christian traditions. Why religion? I'm kind of going back to a variation of the question I asked you first. So why not leave this to scientists, those who are creating these technologies, to physicians? Why pay attention to what religious people think, religious discourse? I mean, I know I make my living as a scholar of religion, but that's not a good enough reason. So why religion?
I would say the main reason is something we might call like role demarcation. So if I want someone to repair my broken ankle, I want to see a physician. If I want to make sure the nuclear power plant doesn't blow up, I'll see a physicist. But these debates, and if I decide that I'm going to engineer my child in some particular way, then I'll go see whatever scientist or doctor does that. But these are debates about what we as a society should do. And when it comes to we as a society should do, scientists and physicians should have no more powerful role in that than anyone else. Now, it's important to know how it might work. You know, one of the classic confusions when cloning first was figured out, they said, oh, if you created a clone of Hitler, would he take over a country in the middle of a depression and try to take over the world? You know, people had these fundamental misunderstandings. But beyond that, it's a social issue, and therefore, what the views of the public are more important. Then why look at this religion angle on the public is twofold. In the United States, most people are religious in some manner, number one. And number two, by far the most developed ways of talking about issues like this come from religions, in my opinion. Things like human purpose, why are we here, what are obligations to our children. Now, we could all imagine philosophical traditions, and there's people in this room with training in philosophy. You can say, yes, there are those traditions too, and we could go on about that. But I think for ordinary people, most of this set of ideas comes through religion, so I thought it was most important to study that.
Now, I want them to buy the books. I don't want to give it all away, but so you studied these groups. Which groups were most opposed to reproductive genetic technologies? Which groups were most in favor? Give us a little bit of sense of the reasoning why.
So I wanted to see a lot of these technologies, some of them are currently available. If you want to engage in pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to make sure your child is a certain way, you can do that right now. There was a clinic in Los Angeles that advertised it would soon allow you to select your children by hair color and eye color, and they sort of backed off on this. You can do what's called sperm sorting, which is you can take sperm and sort it through a centrifuge or something and determine the gender of your child with a fairly high degree of accuracy. Some of these things aren't online yet, but I was curious who would be most opposed to this and why. Now, if you do it just a basic survey, the people who are most opposed are conservative Protestants, by which I mean evangelicals and fundamentalists, and traditionalist Catholics. Now then the first instinct is to say, well, of course, that's because this has to do with embryos. And we know also that conservative Protestants and traditionalist Catholics are more opposed to embryonic destruction than other people are. However, many of these things don't involve destroying embryos. Sperm sorting doesn't kill any embryos. It just makes a certain type of person come into existence, and yet they're more opposed to that too. So the question I wanted to ask was why? Well, there's a number of arguments that people make. One is for things involving embryos, that they don't like the technologies that kill embryos. That's pretty straightforward. Most of us are familiar with how that argument goes. Another one is, I use a perhaps awkward term of Promethean fatalism, by which I mean God has a plan for you that you are not supposed to deviate from. So engaging in this technology changes God's plan. Another one is individual dignity. People will say any one person should not be treated any differently than anyone else. And therefore, to pick a child like you'd pick a can of beans is therefore wrong. And finally, conservative Protestants and traditionalist Catholics have a different notion of what it means to suffer than other people do. If you interview secular people, which I had a sample of secular people too, and you interview most liberal Protestants, most Jews, you say, how about the suffering from this disease? Should we get rid of that? And they'd say, are you crazy? I don't even understand the question. Could you repeat the question? You know you've hit upon a taken for granted assumption when people don't even understand your question. And people will say, of course, get rid of the disease. End that suffering. Are you crazy? Traditionalist Catholics and conservative Protestants have an argument about why some suffering, some forms of suffering are actually useful. And the one that you find, if you look into the Christian tradition in particular, is different versions of what it means to be suffered. We could talk about the Augustinian tradition and so on, but to spare the details, conservative Protestants and others think that some forms of suffering are meaningful because they teach both the sufferer and those around them something useful about being in a compassionate society. Now, they don't think that therefore Tay-Sachs is good to see terrible suffering death, but on the mid cases like, should we genetically engineer people so they're not deaf? They don't see, to the extent that's suffering, they say, well, that's suffering, but that's an okay type of suffering. That's actually good for everybody. And so therefore, many things that other people would be in favor of, they're opposed to because they have this different version of suffering.
Now, we know that evangelicals, other conservative Protestants, and traditional Catholics are also more opposed to abortion. Will these fault lines remain the same for reproductive genetic technologies? Can we assume the debate will just fall along those lines as well?
I was very concerned about this because in my past research, I've actually written a lot about the abortion debate. And there's a reason why people single out that one debate as being more problematic in society than anything else, which is that it seems to be the one debate where the people on the two sides not only disagree about a conclusion, but seem to lack a moral language to even communicate with each other. So if we wanted to talk about some war somewhere, people might actually share the same values and say it won't work, if you send it, this isn't a good idea, but there's a shared language where people seem to say the abortion debate, and there's some support for this, there's not even a shared moral language with which to communicate. And so the concern would be if the debate about reproductive genetics gets subsumed into the abortion debate, then no one will have this discussion. It's pointless to discuss, they'll say, and so we won't even have the discussion in society that we should. So I really wanted to see whether this was the case. And so I went to look and see, are people going to talk about abortion in the same way they talk about reproductive genetic technology? And it turns out that when you interview people, so I interviewed a sample of religious people in the United States by their distribution. So 25% of the population are mainline Protestants, so I had 25% mainline Protestants, 33% Catholic, so on and so forth. Turns out, about 50% of these people believe that embryos are persons and shouldn't be harmed. 50% of people have a position on that where they don't take that position, somewhere between officially pro-choice on abortion, more anguished positions, and so on, which is pretty well established. If you look at all the people who say that embryos are people and see how they talk about reproductive genetic technologies, turns out they talk about it the same way. They use these same arguments about abortion as they use about all these other technologies, even technologies that don't involve embryos at all, like sperm sorting, like human genetic engineering, like cloning, assuming you wouldn't hurt any embryos in the process. So that's, all of a sudden I'm thinking to myself, well, this suggests that the reproductive genetic technology debate will be bad. It will be subsumed into the abortion debate, and no one will want to talk about it, because it'll just be a repeat of that. However, when you look at the other side, you look at all the people who don't see embryos as persons, it turns out they use the same language too, to talk about their opposition to reproductive genetics, just at different places. So whereas someone who's opposed to abortion might be opposed to pre-implantation genetic diagnosis for some terrible disease, and they'll use this meaningful suffering language, the liberal will also use that meaningful suffering language, but to say that they're opposed to enhancing people's intelligence. Okay? So they don't reach the same conclusions on issues, but they have the same, let's call it moral vocabulary, which suggests that unlike the abortion debate, they could actually have a conversation where they have some way to talk to each other. They don't agree about the same conclusion, but they could at least talk. So this led me to conclude that in actuality, the reproductive genetic debate, when this happens, isn't just going to become subsumed, sucked into this abortion debate, but may well be more productive.
So you say that the majority of people who are in favor of reproductive genetic technologies are in favor to end horrible diseases. You keep bringing back that language, but they're against in terms of enhancements, the example of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed child. Where do you draw the line?
Right.
Give us the answer. Scholars always say it's so complicated.
Let me cut through 1,000 years of scholarly tradition and just give you the answer right here.
Give us the bottom line.
So, as you've heard from her question, let's just create a continuum, okay, between traits, genetic traits that are universally considered to be diseases of the worst sort. And Tay-Sachs is sort of a classic example of this. It's genetic. If your child has it, they will die at a very young age in a very horrible suffering form of death. Other things that everyone agrees are purely what you would call enhancements. So let's say I can make you 8 feet tall with an IQ of 350 or something like this. Okay. Now, everyone agrees that some people disagree with the method, but even my most ardent pro-life advocates will say, well, if you can figure out some way to not hurt any embryos and fix Tay-Sachs by injecting someone's arm before they have babies, by all means, let's do it. Okay? Everyone agrees with that. Almost no one thinks enhancement, like of intelligence, is the way to go. So where about the middle? The middle are things like, how about deafness? Is deafness a disease, or is deafness not a disease? Or how about something like, let's say I was going to change one of you in the audience to make your children genetically not susceptible to disease. Is that healing disease, or is that an enhancement? Or how about changing you so that your children wouldn't have Alzheimer's disease when they're 70? Is that ending a disease? Or how about age 50? There are these sort of middle range cases, or there's various forms of genetic dwarfism. So where do we draw the line in the middle? Well, most of the discussion with people was where they drew the line. I would interview people and sort of take them down the slippery slope to see where they jump off. Now, philosophers have had a very traditional way to decide, which they've fixed in place disease from enhancement in what the current human body is like. Okay? So they would say what's called the normal functioning standard. And they would say, therefore, it's not a normal function of the body to be deaf. And therefore, to relieve deafness is to relieve a disease. However, it is not a normal function of the body to have an IQ of 750, and therefore, that's an enhancement. Recently, this debate has shifted among professional philosophers to not fix it in the current capacity of the human body, but shift it into what our cultural decision about what disease is. So to say, it truly is not a feature of the human body to have genetic immunity to cancer, but it would be nice if it was. And that would also satisfy our urge to heal disease. And therefore, if you're going to change someone to make them sort of healing disease, even if it's something that no human has ever had, then that's relieving disease. So the question is, with everyone in this room, where you draw this line sort of depends on what you think a disease is. Okay? It also depends on what you think the standard should be, whether what we current humans are capable of doing, or whether we want to use our sort of current aspirations to design this divide into the future.
That's good. I think that's a good place to end. That's sort of where do you draw the line. I now want to open the discussion up to you all and to have you line up behind these two microphones. You'll see them here on this one on this side of the room and one on this side of the room, if you could just, for those who have questions. And I want to give a little guideline for discussion. So these should be phrased as questions, not as statement. For those of you who haven't done this in a while, just to give you a sense of what that means. So a statement would be like, I think this. It ends right in the sort of flat tone. A question ends with an up, a rise in intonation. What do you think? Right? See, so you get that? So these are questions, not speeches and statements. So we'll start over here.
One of the things that you touched on but didn't list as a research finding is what you might call that social justice concern, enhancing the haves and have-nots inappropriately. What did your research find?
So actually in the book, you find a very interesting divide in what people think dignity means if you look at it very carefully, conservative Protestants think that each individual should be treated the same. Liberal Protestants, Jews and liberal Catholics don't have that same focus. They're focused on that any two groups of people should be considered the same. So the social justice orientation is more limited to those groups. So this concern about the Gattaca scenario, where we create the genetic haves and the have-nots, that, while I'm sure if I introduced that to the conservative Protestants, they would say, oh yeah, I'm opposed to that too, that's not what comes to their mind first. It is what comes to the mind of the traditionalist Catholics, of the liberal Catholics and the liberal Protestants. So it's an interesting divide in how they view our sort of responsibility that emerges. It's consistent with what Michael Emerson in this department finds about race, and if I'm articulate this properly, he finds that conservative Protestantism lacks a language to talk about group racial inequality, because they think of individuals as being the ones standing before God, not collectivities. And I see it sort of extrapolating out to this issue as well.
Yes, pardon me. I believe that anytime you talk about disease prevention, you talk about reproduction in those areas, you also have to look at economic policies. And I'm talking about insurance company policies, long-term cost related to raising children that may have these diseases. Did your study take any look at economic considerations and how that might change people's viewpoints?
Yeah. I did no examination of that whatsoever, primarily because I had to sort of pick my battles and what I was focused on. But I will say that you're absolutely correct in that the classic sort of sociological way of describing this is that you don't really have a choice if you don't have a choice, right? And so, you know, we can say all we want about being able to raise children in various ways, but if you have to pay for their care for their entire life and it's going to bankrupt you and your family, is that really a choice? So there's no question that that's a concern. Many of the advocates who are concerned with these technologies have been trying to pass bills through Congress that eliminate forms of what you would call essentially genetic discrimination. And some of that has passed. I think the healthcare bill had a piece of this in there, but this is a recurring issue, and I think if you were to present people what you think about this, if the family had to spend the rest of their money for the rest of their lives on this, you would have a different perspective, absolutely.
There seems to be a murky line between aesthetics and well-being as this has been expressed, like you mentioned, an 8-foot-tall, 750 IQ person. I'm not even sure if we have a handle on what IQ really is, or intelligence. And I'm not sure in this 8-foot-tall doesn't seem practical to me. When I hear that, I think of, a lot of problems with joints and bones, just trying to support the weight and this gravity that we're bound in on planet Earth. And I also believe that it seems to be that genetic manipulation, there seems to be a mindset on point mutations as opposed to polygenic traits.
Right. Well, there's no question that certainly the way I present this to people is a very simplistic 1970s era version of genetics, right? So to give you the very basics of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but that these single trait diseases that are like this one genetic sequence out of place are very straightforward to understand. But when you get to things that you would call intelligence, if we can even describe what that is certainly some sort of, if it's genetically affected at all, it's some sort of interaction between dozens or hundreds of genes in some way we can't describe, to say nothing of epigenetics, which is another entire thing. So this is this incredibly complicated thing. There's this great line from one of the theological critics from the 1950s that says basically the only thing that saved us is science's inability to understand this, because our aspirations are to have the superhuman, super intelligent, whatever, but it's definitely not online in any sense, because I agree, I don't think that people can even describe intelligence. Now, that said, I was at a meeting with Randall Collins, that's not his name, Francis Collins, oh yeah, president of the American Sociological Association, whoops. Easy slip. Francis Collins, who said something like, I know there's a gene for intelligence right now that will add 1/3 of 1% to your memory or something like that. It was some tinily inconsequential thing, and he goes, I'm sure it interacts with 27 others, you know. So he suggested that there was heading towards some understanding, but this is, I agree, this is like years down the
It seems to parallel, just one final point, it seems to parallel this argument about aging. I mean, everybody's freaking out about this one little sirtuin gene when this is a polygenic thing. Anyway, I'll end there. Thanks.
As a student who's about to start their medical education, I guess I'm kind of interested in how physicians can play their part. Because I do agree with what you said, that physicians shouldn't have more of a right to speak about what society does. But as a reality, I believe they're seen as the keepers of health. And in that way, they may be disproportionately called upon, beyond just their expertise, to kind of make critical decisions. And one thing that I've seen be consistently true is that at best, physicians are retrofitted for things along these lines. Their traditional education doesn't prepare them to handle ethical issues and engage in society to talk about this and help people better understand it. And I was wondering if you could give a recommendation. How can we improve medical education and how we train physicians in order to engage these sorts of ethical dilemmas beforehand?
Well, good question. So in my university, we have an attempt at this, which is there's an enormous number of pre-med students, and a good chunk of them are in what's called the Healthcare Social Issues minor, and they take my lecture class called Genetics and Society, where they sort of think through these issues. But that's very mild. You know, medical schools are required by a regulatory authority to teach ethics, but I think it's a very constrained form of ethics. And so, right, you are a bit adrift. I would like to make some distinctions. I think it's very important that you, as a physician, be able to help individuals be aware of ethical problems. I think the problem is a lot of people just sort of coast, you know, and to sort of help people become aware of resources that would exist for them. You are correct that physicians are given sort of a bigger soapbox in the public sphere. But I always want that to be a bit more constrained to the expertise that physicians have. So for example, physicians are really good at knowing what their patients are sort of thinking about these things, or more so than other people. They're not good judges of what the values of American society are. You know, they have no more expertise in that than anyone else. And so I guess I would really encourage you as a future physician to really try to become aware of these issues in order to help all your future patients and to contribute your expertise in the public sphere in the realm of expertise you have, which I suspect will be when people come to talk to me about these problems, they want to know about this, 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 and this. And therefore, you people in the public need to find a way for us to deal with this, 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 and this.
Thank you.
Hi, this evening we've talked about have and have-nots, and also a gentleman over there mentioned economics. So what that makes me think of, as we talk about today in America where we have a big divide between the rich and the poor, is, and I would make the assumption that this sort of manipulation is not cheap.
You would be correct.
That I wonder, what does that mean for society where, you know, a so-called wealthy person can make their child better, whether they're more attractive or more intelligent, and then what does that mean for the rest of us that can't afford that? Or, for example, a wealthy person is able to make their child healthy, whereas another person can't, or someone who has less means. So what does that mean for our society and trying to get us to an area where people are, I guess, have the same opportunities?
Right. So this is a fundamental problem. The way this is usually portrayed is all of those things about inequality you've described already exist in cultural form. I'm upper middle class. I'm a professor at the University in California, and I'm having my daughter take piano lessons. That's going to give her this small leg up on whatever, you know. And I want my kid to go to Rice. If there's anyone from the admissions committee here, I'll tell you their names. But, you know, that takes a certain amount of money, resources, absolutely. The concern has always been, let's not write our social inequality into our genetic sequence itself. Where it is true that all this stuff, if you could actually engage in pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, that is not covered by your, I mean, some of it would be potentially covered by your insurance, but this is a rich person's game, okay? To say nothing of if any one of these other technologies come online, this is not going to be covered by your health insurance, okay? That said, it will only exacerbate or reinforce existing forms of inequality if the genetic intervention actually gives the person additional advantage. And so far, again, unless someone comes up with intelligence, a way to engineer intelligence, I'm at present not so concerned about it. Now, there is definitely differential access to health. So for example, if you wanted to make sure that your child doesn't have some genetic cystic fibrosis or something like this, that's definitely a recurring issue, but that's always with all the health care in America, right? So in terms of different access to all these things, absolutely. The deeper concern that we would essentially write the existing inequality into the genome itself, I'm less concerned because I'm still not convinced that it will essentially produce any additional advantage, except when the person invents this sort of gene for superintelligence or memory. Thank you.
Hi. So earlier you were talking about how certain technologies can be considered enhancements and some can't. I was wondering where you think a procedure like female circumcision would fall into place, and as a follow-up, how far do you think you can extend the argument presented in your book beyond the United States, such as to places where Islam or Hinduism are the predominant religions?
So, okay, so female circumcision, I would say just for starters, is not genetic and not reproductive in any way. I would consider it at first thought to be essentially a form of negative cosmetic surgery. It's sort of like an anti-enhancement. I mean, this is my perspective. I mean, there are people in these societies who would probably view it as a positive genetic or positive bodily modification. And so I view that simply as it's like if people in this society like breast implants, I view that as sort of a negative modification. Don't know much about it. All right, now, in terms of other societies, you should know that the classic sociological trick here is to, at this point, hide behind my data and say, I didn't gather any data on that, so I don't really know, okay? Now, I'm more comfortable extrapolating from this to similar cultural traditions. So if I go to England, I can sort of map analogs of all these people. If I'm up in Scotland, the Church of Scotland are more or less mainline Protestants. The Weefrees and these other people are like evangelicals, Catholics. I'm willing to do that. Germany, willing to do that. By the time I get to like the Middle East, Islam and the like, I think it's just a totally different story whatsoever. Here's what little I know. That embryos have different meaning in these traditions. So for example, in Judaism, an extra bodily embryo has no moral status. Okay, so embryos in test tubes are morally irrelevant or neutral, whatever you want to say. My understanding of Islam is very similar. Iran, of all places, has decided to be the king of stem cell research, apparently. For one of the reasons is that morally, Islam has no objection to this sort of stuff whatsoever. I do know that people who live in Middle Eastern countries are huge consumers. The rich people in these countries are huge consumers of these technologies. But that's about all I know. Sorry.
Yes. So I'm curious as to what the policy implications of your work are. So specifically, if you were to outline a list of policy objectives for maybe right now or 10 years from now or whenever these genetic procedures may become available, what would you say those would be?
I think I would say that here's what I would advocate that people, depending on their position, is. I think I'm not willing to take off my sociologist hat and advocate the actual policy that should exist. But I would say for those people who are concerned that these technologies will teach us some different notion of the human, what you would then advocate is some way of making them illegal. And then how would you do that, would be the question. This is actually all very controllable. Other European countries control this stuff to an incredible degree through various regulatory forms. In principle, in Germany right now, there are no embryos in freezers anywhere because they've regulated in vitro fertilization that as many embryos you fertilize, you have to implant to the woman at that moment. It's not allowed. So we could do all of that. So it would be more like, if you think that that's a concern, I think that would be the policy position you would take. But it's beyond my competence. It would just be my individual opinion as to what we as a society should do. So I'll sort of.
Do you think we should pursue specific policies now as a government?
Okay, so that I'm willing to take a position on, which is I do think that we as a society should most definitively take some position one way or the other, simply because I believe that things that affect the collective should be collectively decided and not just be allowed to sort of dribble along until the change is already complete. So for example, let's say it is true, and this is an open question, let's say it is true that these technologies would change what it means to be human. Everyone in this room has an interest in what it means to be human, okay? And therefore, if you don't like what this change would be, then we should collectively decide not to do it. Now, we could collectively decide to do it. We say, it doesn't bother me enough, who cares? We could collectively decide, that's fine. But I do think that in general, societies are better off when they actually make conscious decisions of what they do with their future, instead of just letting things sort of dribble along. I mean, maybe I'm totally about to get myself thrown off the stage, but my understanding is Houston is...
Not so far.
Well, I'm about to talk about Houston.
It's carry on.
I understand Houston is a city who doesn't have any zoning policy. Okay, so it strikes me as there was some time, you like it, okay, well there was a time, let's say there were people who didn't like that, okay? Let's say, okay? 50 years on, it's too late. Things have been built. So an analogous thing would be, if you don't like what's about to happen with the new genetic future, 50 years from now, it's too late. Okay? People who didn't like amniocentesis, it's too late in the sense, I mean, you could make abortion illegal, but now, if you're a doctor and you do not let your patients know that that is an option available to you, that's a violation of the rules. You know? So things get institutionalized, and so therefore we as a society should decide now, pro or con, but I do agree with that.
Thank you.
Hello. Earlier, with respect to the term Promethean fatalism, you mentioned that the traditional Protestant and Catholic opposition to the use of genetic technologies stems from the fact that some forms of suffering are beneficial to the sufferer and those around him or her. You also mentioned with regards to where we draw the line on the use of genetic technologies, that many philosophers will use some sort of quantitative scheme with respect to the normal functioning standard to determine whether something is an enhancement or the removal of some sort of disease. Do you think that the reason for the opposition of these traditional religious groups stems from the lack of such a quantitative scheme, or perhaps from my ignorance, if there is one, do you think that there is some way to reconcile the two to create some sort of policy that is agreeable to both sides?
I don't think it's actually incompatible. You're talking about these incompatible structures of how these people make ethical decisions. And I don't think that a disagreement has to do with that, really. There is a fundamental sort of divide in how a lot of sort of scientific, philosophical views of humanness and the religious views, but I don't think that this is the sort of divide. I think that when you interview people about, where you should jump off the slippery slope, whether it's okay to modify someone so they're not deaf or a dwarf or something like that, I don't think the religious tradition lacks the sort of places to jump off. I think it's just they have different things of value, and therefore these different things of value just tell you to jump off sooner or later. But it's not sort of a lack of a sort of a similar reasoning system that causes the problem.
Could you give some examples?
Well, so let's say you had a gene. This is obviously for the scientists in the room. I'm just making this up. Let's say you had a gene that your children would develop Alzheimer's disease when they were 10, okay? Or maybe 20, or 30, or 40, and let's take 10-year increments up to 80. Where do you at some point decide that changing that is healing disease or enhancing your child, okay? You're saying essentially that a scientific view would have sort of a metric, some sort of way of calculating this divide.
Yes.
Whereas most religion would have a similar way of creating a divide. It just wouldn't, scientists don't have any quantitative way of doing it, and religious doesn't have any quantitative way of doing it either. They would just sort of pick a point and make a decision. So I don't see the reasoning as any different.
But with science, you do have some sort of data or numerical data to back it up, whereas with religion, it would be more of an intuitive or an appeal to God sense, or from my perspective.
Yeah, but science doesn't have any quantitative or numeric way of backing any of this up. So the only way you could say, let's say we could create one, we could say quality adjusted years of life. So this is one commensurable metric we could create. People create these formulas like, each year of your life is worth some certain amount, and we could create these sort of but the fact that you find that a value is a purely qualitative judgment that's no more objective than anything else. And so I think a lot of the sort of claims to precision are actually a bit illusory.
We're gonna go ahead over here.
I'm curious, what, if any, findings in your research touched on the topics of mental illness or cognitive impairment, like someone who's developmentally delayed? Where did the two groups you mentioned, from the liberal to the fundamentalistics, where did they fall in that? And what are your own considerations around that?
I didn't specifically ask about mental cognition sort of issues. I'm willing to extrapolate from what conservatives talked about people with Down syndrome. So there's definitely a different way of talking about people with Down syndrome, primarily among evangelicals and fundamentalists, less so among Catholics, that was more like Down syndrome people teach everyone else important lessons about humanity. And therefore, it's good that they exist. Okay? Now that dovetails with, it's good that they exist because they're also persons and I want to treat them all equally, sort of all part of a package here. And so therefore, they're not so concerned with avoiding people who would have, for example, Down syndrome. Now, if I were to get one of my liberal respondents and present that to them, they'd say, oh yeah, I agree with that. But it's not the first thing that comes to mind. The first thing that comes to mind is that someone with Down syndrome would be suffering to some extent and would result in the people around them suffering to some extent. So there is this subtle difference. It's not an enormous, black and white sort of thing, but I do think there is that subtle difference about that they sort of think of as analogous. I didn't ask specifically about it, but enough people brought that up that I would be willing to extrapolate to that.
We're going to take just these two more and then call it to a close. Yeah.
John, I want to compliment you on an outstanding presentation and all your work. When we have a family member with something like a spinal cord injury, we suddenly, of course, are highly motivated to want something done. And I'm talking in terms of embryonic stem cell research. And yet today, many of our people, our physicians, our researchers, are having to leave the country to do that. In your study, did you look at did you get a feeling of what people feel? Because we're talking here about diseases, being able to perhaps improve the life of individuals, or did you feel there's still a complacency about that?
So I didn't ask about that simply because embryonic stem cell research is not reproduction at all, but involves the sort of products of reproduction. But I'm willing to extrapolate from that based upon other research that I've done, which is, number one, there is a large opposition. Okay, there are very few people who are perfectly, quote unquote, consistent about embryos, who would believe that there's no instance whatsoever when an embryo should be harmed. And because of that, there's people willing to trade off in various ways. Now the trade-offs, there are going to be a lot more people willing to trade off, and most people, I have to say, most people are not absolutist about this, but almost no one is nonchalant either. You know, the jokes about mainline Protestants, you know, like the Presbyterian Church USA statement on abortion is like 47 pages long. You know, the one by the Southern Baptist Convention is a paragraph. You know, like, so mainline Protestants are famous for this, okay? You talk to mainline Protestants about embryos and they're like, oh, on the one hand this, on the one hand that, I'm very agonized, etc. So everyone's very agonized. I think the agonize, if it actually were shown to work, that would change the debate. There's very little evidence so far from the guys down the hill from me that it immediately will work. That's number one. Number two, I think that people really do very much value health. It's really the sort of one standard, yet there is a definite part of the population that would say health is not everything, we have to limit ourselves in various ways to retain what it means to be human. But I do think that were it to be shown to be efficacious, the debate would change markedly, rapidly.
So you spoke of philosophers' deviations or correcting negative deviations from the normal under the assumption that normal is necessarily best from these negative deviations. So for instance, in certain cultures, additional limbs or fingers are actually considered good or lucky and will enhance their stature and social status. As a student of anthropology, I was taught that all knowledge is situated in context, both social and historical. So can it be supposed that a product of our social context rather than true human quality is this subjective idea of non-normality? And what would you say to correcting such deviations from the normal?
So sociologists generally share this anthropological sense that social context determines what people perceive to be real. If I would go back to the 1420s, I'm sure I'd get everyone have a different view of everything. What you're pointing to is actually the reason why many people want to retain the idea that we should draw the line at what's currently in the human body. And they're afraid of what you're saying, which is essentially that in some cultures, 6 fingers on a hand is good, and that's normal, and therefore we should genetically engineer everyone to have 6 fingers on one hand and 4 on the other, or whatever, okay? The traditional advantage in people's minds is that the current bodily form argument is not relativistic. So let me give you the strongest version, which I didn't give you, which is there are some fertility clinics that have a really strict version of this, which is their version of a not enhancement is anything that the 2 parents who come into the room could produce on their own. Okay? Let's say there is someone who's like an Einstein who exists, who's got a very high IQ. Well, we can't say that's normal because these 2 people in front of me couldn't produce it. I'm going to define normal as what these two people could produce were they not having some genetic error or something. You're pointing to something which is the concern of many people, which is, what do we do in a situation where we define the enhancement disease line as what we currently consider to be disease? So if I do an anthropological study of people in the rainforest of Brazil, their notion of what a disease is totally different than mine and ours. Okay? The concern is, what do we do 40 years from now where we say, oh, lack of intelligence, that's a disease. People are under 7 feet tall, that's just a disease. Okay? And to say that this doesn't happen would ignore the history of things like human growth hormone. I mean, whenever the company discovered how to make human growth hormone, they then defined a new disorder called essentially shortness, defined it as the bottom 5% of the height distribution, said every kid in the bottom 5% of the height distribution needs to use our chemical to make themselves taller, and we're not going to tell you that there'll always be a bottom 5% of the height distribution, and so therefore someone always has to use our drug. So the danger is, of course, that if we don't fix it somewhere, this is what's going to happen. So I agree with you totally in my perspective. And I just want to say that that's the two ways that people have divided this, and that you're pointing to something that's very important that people should really think about.
Yes. Well, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight and remind you that we will continue to mingle out in the foyer. Professor Evans will be signing some books for those of you who wish to do that, and please continue the conversation informally. I want to thank you for coming. This has been a wonderful conversation, and thank Professor Evans again for giving us a lot to think about.